Hi, I'm Marc Childs from Childs Davidson. Welcome to our video series on FMCG issues. I recently ran a workshop at a national industry conference on the topic of future-proofing the commercial functions. It's an important topic, so I'm going to repeat here the main points that we raised. Change is not new to our industry, of course. We've been changing and adapting for many decades now. But I believe that we've come to a tipping point where so many significant changes have come together that this is something really new for our industry. You know, history shows that in pretty much any industry, the leaders prior to a significant change, a fundamental change in the conditions in that industry, quite often don't emerge as the leaders after that change. And the reason is manifold, of course, but primarily it's about incumbency. It's difficult to respond to and embrace change when you're a leader with entrenched patterns of behaviour. So I want to talk to you first of all about what I think are 5 big things that are changing in the industry and tell you why I think that it's time to start to rethink and reinvent. The first of what I see as the significant change factors in our industry is the continuing, steady and virtually inexorable loss of differentiation of products and brands in many categories. Of course, one symptom of that is the growth of private label around the world that seems to go unchecked. The second is, equally unchecked, the rapid growth of discounters around the world. We're expecting that they'll reach perhaps 20% of market share in our industry by about 2025. The third, happening at the same time, is the growing volume sold on deal. Now, all of those things add up to the fact that brands are working harder to maintain and grow volume in many categories. But underlying that is the fact that shoppers' interest lies elsewhere these days. Their discretionary money is going elsewhere, and they are, in our industry, redefining the concept of value. Consequences are that FMCG is losing share of wallet and in fact losing share of mind. I from time to time still hear marketers talking about creating excitement around their products, but let's be honest, in centre of store, all those rows of boxes are pretty boring. The other issue underlying this is that innovation is becoming harder to achieve. And I believe we've got to fairly urgently rethink the scope and depth of innovation and think in terms of reinvention. The second significant change factor is lack of growth around the world. Of course, we've faced downturns in our industry in the past, but this is something quite new. The world economy seems to have entered a period of stagnation that many commentators think is probably likely to last at least into the medium term. When we add to that the fact that, again, in many markets, price deflation has become a common feature, tied in with, of course, more volume sold on deals so that average selling prices are coming down everywhere. The challenge for manufacturers in these conditions is to search for new channels of distribution to try and find other areas of growth, given that big box retailers don't seem to be providing that growth in the way that we've been historically used to them doing. And what that means is discovering new thinking in the way we go to market and the marketing processes that we use. The other one is that, and this ties into the fact of incumbency. As an industry, we're bound by the financial ratio norms that we're used to. This much % for trade spend, another % for advertising, another % for COGS. And we find it very difficult to move beyond those ratios. We review ourselves, we set budgets, and we set KPIs and performance expectations around those ratios. I do believe, though, that that's what a sailor would call steering by your wake. In other words, looking backwards at your wake to steer forward. And it's time that we start to challenge those ratios and norms. The third major change issue I want to mention is shrinking range distribution. Versus a long history of continuing growth of SKU count in major stores, we're now on the downhill side of that. Retailers know they've got too many SKUs. Shoppers increasingly want simplicity, and of course discounters have been very successful in redefining what simplicity means for shoppers. At the same time, retailers know that their main source of differentiation comes from the perimeter of the store. So of course they've got very strong incentive for shrinking centre of store and emphasising, fresh produce, deli, etc. around the perimeter. At the same time, we know that the fastest growing store formats in the world are small stores and of course much smaller range. So again, pressure on range distribution. Clearly, manufacturers need to get out ahead of the curve and focus on rationalising ahead of that and making sure that what they've got is relevant for a shrinking distribution environment. The fourth major challenge I want to mention is the rapidly changing digital world and the fact that most FMCG manufacturers are poorly equipped to engage with it effectively. Prior to the workshop that I ran that led to this video, we did a quick analysis of about 20 FMCG websites, and we found that they were really essentially designed as passive brand information sites with very little apparent understanding of how to engage the shopper and take them through the path to purchase. It seems quite clear that manufacturers are still stuck in an old linear paradigm, whereas new retail is anything but linear, and new thought processes and new expertise about how to go to market in that environment are vital to future growth. The fifth major change issue I want to mention is that best new talent seems to be going elsewhere these days. 20 or 30 years ago, new graduates would have regarded FMCG as the place to go to start your career. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. In the US, where they survey new graduates on their employment preference, in 2012, Procter & Gamble was ranked number 3 across all industry groups. By 2015, they were still best amongst FMCG, but they had slipped to number 10, and the number of FMCG companies in the top 50 had declined as well. If you look at MBA graduates, they're surveyed every year on their top 5 preferred employers. In 2012, only 3% of them mentioned an FMCG company in their top 5. By 2015, that had slipped a little more to 2.7%. At the same time, Google, as you might expect, was at 25.7% 3 years ago and has increased their level of preference to 27.1%. Now, clearly, if we're going to deal with change of the kind that I've been describing here, we need best talent. And FMCG companies are going to need to work out how to attract them. And when we add to that the challenge of embracing and dealing with new requirements of Generation Z as they enter the workforce, this becomes an increasing issue for FMCG companies to face. My views on how the industry needs to respond to these dramatically changing conditions are necessarily relatively general, given that every company has its own nuances and issues that it faces. But let's deal with them under 3 main headings. Firstly, we need to redesign our organisations to deliver much more consistently on innovation across everything that we do. I have a client in the UK who's running a program about learned helplessness, where their aim is to get people to realise the boundaries that they've created for themselves and to challenge those boundaries. At the same time, we need to make sure that we're making room for challenging personalities in our business. In the past, where we might have ruled certain people out because they had characteristics that weren't particularly team supportive, These days, we need some of those people. We need them to be nurtured and to be the challengers who will break down the barriers that are stopping us from innovating. Second, organisations need to set themselves up to more effectively embrace the knowledge age. When we first started hearing about the age of information, I wasn't really sure what that meant, but clearly now there are major corporations that don't make or own anything. They're just all about knowledge, and they have brilliant systems for managing that knowledge. Companies like Uber, Airbnb, eBay, even Amazon are among the fastest growing global corporations these days. For manufacturers, of course, the challenge of embracing knowledge when they're drowning in information is a major one. I think it really needs to start with very deliberately designed decision models. That means understanding the methodology for making decisions, knowing who's going to be involved and who's going to apply that knowledge, and creating a home for all of the information that's being processed in the business. Fundamental to that, and I believe critical to the success of a lean, agile, effective organisation these days, is integrated business planning. And that means an information system that's all-embracing, that requires the organisation to reach consensus and function as one machine effectively. Thirdly, companies will need to rethink their whole approach to marketing. And that's a complex issue. It's made up of a couple of different dimensions. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, is that old ideas of linear through-the-line or go-to-market strategy will no longer apply in the new marketplace, which is anything but linear. But also, I've complained for many years, as a matter of fact, that many organisations that are very brand-focused are not very good at focusing on categories and understanding the context for their brands. They'll tell you that they do. They'll tell you they did do research about consumers and so on. But the problem is, if you've got brands that you're trying to push into the marketplace, it's a little bit like my old favourite saying, if all I've got's a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. If companies are going to be more responsive to the marketplace, they need to go out and understand categories much more thoroughly than they do now. The other aspect of this is that in thinking about the category and the needs of consumers and shoppers in that category, companies have an opportunity to rethink the whole idea of how they deliver to those needs. There's some great examples of this. Nespresso, when they realized that the consumers wanted real coffee increasingly around the world, invented Nespresso as a way of delivering that in the home. Similarly, and another one I like very much, is Coke's recent development in acquiring Green Mountain and planning to deliver glasses of Coke in the home by using a pod that's inserted in a similar machine to a Nespresso machine. The other is that companies will need to rethink their use of IP. A great example of this is Hasbro, the toy company, who are transitioning quite deliberately from being, physical toy makers to being owners of IP and looking at how that IP can be commercialized right across the board. A great example they've given me is My Little Pony, which of course is a little kid's plastic toy. But what it's become is a brand and an IP that they're extending into movies and clothing and a whole range of other possibilities. Finally, given all of these major challenges that our industry faces, and the fact that individual companies will need to radically adapt their strategies, their processes, and their capabilities, I believe they'll need to go back to a zero-based approach to strategic planning. That means looking at strategic competencies in a new world, but also being willing, as I mentioned earlier, to challenge existing norms, particularly financial norms, and be prepared to accept that profit and loss statements and balance sheets may not continue to look the way they've been in the past. This is Marc Childs from Childs Davidson. Thank you for watching.